So we're in the evolution unit, and we're looking at the importance of variation and how variation leads to changes in populations. We are trying to really carefully keep in mind what is the definition of evolution. And what we'll see is how does change in the population actually occur. So we were harping a lot, we were focusing on what is variation, trying to be really clear that most of the time we're trying to talk about genetic variation as compared to acquired variation. So something that is coded for by your DNA and can be passed on is kind of the hallmark. Acquired variations might be changes in the DNA, like a mutation, but it might not actually be passed on to the offspring. And so when we talk about how does variation occur, we also really want to talk about the effect of variation. And so when we have genetic variation, remember sometimes we're talking about a genotype. And genetic variation will have an effect on the phenotype variation. Except I'm going to put a question mark there. Because not always, keep in mind the redundancy of the genetic code, keep in mind the ability to fix errors, keep in mind that not all genes are expressed in all cells. So, sometimes if we have genetic variation, we will have phenotypical variation. And so what we're actually going to see is that over time, genetic variation accumulates. So keeping in mind that idea that as we reproduce, the offspring are not identical to the parent. Even if you're an asexually reproducing organism, you are going to have some genetic variation as we look through generations, just because of mutations. And so we start to see this genetic variation accumulate. So if we look at a population, we see that, well, they're all birds. But we've got differences in feather color, differences in eye shape, differences in head size, differences in beak size, differences in beak shape, differences in beak color. But the idea is that they all could have come from a common ancestor. And that as this common ancestor reproduced, we ended up with a much larger variety of the generations later offspring. Now when you look at this diagram, this is a pretty rich diagram. There's a lot going on in there. We've got common names of organisms, we've got scientific names of organisms, we've got characteristics that are behavioral, such as what they eat. We've got characteristics that are genetic and phenotypical, such as their color. So this is a really rich diagram that we're going to come back to a little bit later. What we're looking at next is we are very comfortable talking about natural selection now, but it turns out that this is a theory that had to be developed. And so when scientists were looking at theories for changes in species over time, what does that mean? So when scientists were looking at diversity, and when scientists were looking at like extinctions, so once we started to discover fossils and go, whoa, where is this organism? And we're looking at fossils of giraffe-like organisms that had very short necks. Or we're looking at horses that were very short and going, how did this happen? How is it that these organisms changed over time? And so there was a beginning theory. And this theory is from Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And we do need to know his name, and a lot of times you'll just see it referred to as Lamarck. Lamarck had a theory of acquired characteristics, and the theory is basically any changes, remember delta is change in an adult could be passed on to the offspring. Now, we know much better, because we know about DNA, and we know about meiosis, and we know about sexual reproduction. But they didn't at this point. All that they had was the fossil evidence as well as whatever animals and plants were around during that time. And it was also actually called the use and disuse idea. And so the main example that is usually used is the giraffe stretching their neck. And Felicia actually brought up the concept of, in some African cultures, how they use the rings to stretch their neck. And so Lamarck is arguing that if an organism uses a trait, then the offspring will inherit that trait. And it made a little bit of sense because we did see trends between parent and offspring. So you do inherit traits. Turns out you just don't inherit acquired traits. So Lamarck's argument is the more something was used, the more it was passed on. And that if you weren't using something, it would get lost. So these are all big theories that existed, putting question marks by them because they're actually been proven wrong. And we can actually think back and see how this almost makes sense when we talk about natural selection, because we are talking about survival, and the more likely you are to survive. But it's not whether the organism uses it. It really has to do with, does it help the organism survive? So you could use it all you want, but if it doesn't help you survive, and then the fact of where did that come from? The giraffe cannot actually stretch its neck. And even if it could stretch its neck, it doesn't pass that on to offspring. It's just like the idea of building up a big muscle, like biceps, and then having a baby, and expecting the baby to come out with biceps. Even if that big muscle helps me survive, I can't pass that on to the offspring. So we started to have a lot of argument over how is it passed on to the offspring? Is it passed on to the offspring because it was used? Because it wasn't used? And so a really fairly ingenious experiment was a man named August Weismann, and that is Weissman, August Weismann, and he wanted to prove that this was wrong. And so what he did is he cut off the mice's tails. And then they had babies. And I bet that you can guess what the babies were like. The babies had tails. So even though the parent mouse didn't have it, didn't use it, the babies still came out with it, proving that it wasn't the use of something that guaranteed it got passed on. There was another factor contributing to whether it was passed on, and we know, of course, now that that's your DNA, and that you have that DNA for the tail in all your cells. You don't just have DNA for the tail, coding for the tail in the tail cells. Every single cell in the mouse's body has the genes to code for a tail, especially the sperminae. So, where are we now? We have disproven August Weismann, and we're kind of without any real theory or real supporting evidence of what is actually happening. And so this is where we get to our famous naturalist, Charles Darwin. If we take a side note and talk about him for just a second. Charles Darwin was being trained as a doctor, and he, on his family's request, and he did not want to be a doctor. He wanted to be a naturalist. So Charles Darwin, if we talk about him, we need to refer to the fact that he was really interested in nature. He enjoyed going out into the field and making observations. What do I see? So the what? And, of course, any good scientist also asks the why question. So instead of sitting in a stuffy office and coming up with ideas that have no evidence, Charles Darwin was actually out in what we call the field. And he traveled on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. So he was English, and he went on this expedition to the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are really important because it turns out that islands play a really big role, environmental role. Darwin's basic thing that he came back with after years and years away from England was that species were unstable. Well, that's not what he got credit for, but that is actually his biggest idea, is that species were unstable. And so if we look at, here we see the Galapagos Islands off the western shore of South America in the South Pacific Island. And so, the South Pacific Ocean. So we've got these islands here. Well, why is it that the islands were so important? Why the islands? Well, here we have a diagram of the islands. And so what we start to see is that we have varied environments. So what does that mean? So that means that some of these beaches are very sandy, some of these beaches have a lot of woods. Some of these beaches have a lot of trees, some of them have mostly cacti. And so the environment itself is very, very different. What this means is that we are going to have differences in survival. But really what that means, so varied environments means differences in your basic supplies. So differences in what we call limiting factors, such as food. And these limiting factors are going to choose the survivors. So who survives on the Isla Pinta is going to be very different from who survives on any of the other islands, because this island is a different environment than the others. It might have more or less food, it might have a certain type of food, and so depending on that environment, the environment is who is doing the choosing, or, as Darwin said, the selecting, the natural selection. We do have to keep in mind the role of inheritance. We are usually going to see evolution start with a specific gene pool. Meaning, anytime that we look at natural selection or evolution, we kind of have a point of reference. Where am I starting to collect my data? And once we have that gene pool, the environment may, and I'm going to really underline may, because sometimes it doesn't have an effect, depending on the trait that we're looking for. The environment may allow some to survive better. So when we look at this diagram, what we're looking at in this bottom diagram is a picture of Darwin's finches. And the main idea that we want to get to take away from this is the idea that depending on what food was available, fruit, insects, cactus, seed, we really don't see any of these organisms existing in the seed environment because their beak isn't right for opening seeds. And so that's not saying that I couldn't take one and put it on an island. It's just saying that if this organism were on that island, that it would probably die. It wouldn't be able to feed itself. And so the islands, again, really come into play because we have all of these different varieties. It is believed that this common ancestor was from the mainland of South America. And they have actually looked in the countries that are on the western coast and found some that look like this. Finally, what we want to just kind of preview is how did Darwin actually support his ideas? And so we'll go into this more in class tomorrow. What is natural selection? And how is Darwin able to support it by talking about artificial selection or breeding?